Jessica Morrison had never been particularly religious, but desperation has a way of driving people to places they'd never otherwise go. At 24, she'd moved to Atlanta 3 months earlier with dreams of breaking into the music industry, only to find herself waitressing at a diner in Buckhead, barely scraping together rent for her studio apartment in East Atlanta. The Eternal Grace Pentecostal Church stood on a corner in southwest Atlanta, its white facade gleaming under the Georgia sun. Jessica had walked past it dozens of times on her way to her second job at a dry cleaner, but she'd never gone inside until that humid Sunday morning in June, when her landlord's eviction notice felt like a weight in her purse. The church was packed with families dressed in their Sunday best, the air thick with perfume, and the sound of gospel music pouring from the choir. Jessica slipped into a back pew, feeling out of place in her simple cotton dress, her strawberry blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. She'd come because her co-worker Keisha had mentioned that Pastor William Hartley sometimes helped congregation members with financial assistance, especially young people trying to get on their feet. Pastor Hartley took the pulpit with the confidence of a man half his age. At 72, he was tall and lean, with a full head of silver hair swept back from a face that retained handsome features despite the deep lines carved by 7 decades. His voice resonated through the church with practiced authority, his sermon about redemption and second chances delivered with the kind of charisma that had built his congregation over 40 years of ministry. After the service, Keisha introduced Jessica to the pastor during the fellowship hour in the church basement. His handshake was warm, his smile genuine, his eyes a piercing blue that seemed to look right through her. "Sister Jessica," he said, his southern accent softening the words. "Keisha tells me you're new to Atlanta, trying to find your path. The Lord brings people to our doors for a reason." They spoke for 20 minutes about her situation, her failed music dreams, her mounting debts. Pastor Hartley listened with what seemed like genuine compassion, nodding at the right moments, offering words of encouragement that felt personal rather than generic. Before she left, he pressed a business card into her hand. "Come by my office tomorrow evening," he said quietly. "I counsel young people through difficult transitions. Perhaps I can help guide you toward the opportunities the Lord has prepared." Jessica left the church feeling lighter than she had in months, unaware that Pastor William Hartley had used these exact words with 4 other young women over the past 6 years, and that none of them had lived to speak about what happened in his private counsel. The pastor's office was located in a separate building behind the main church, a modest brick structure that housed administrative offices and counseling rooms. Jessica arrived at 6:30 on Monday evening, just as the Georgia heat was beginning to relent. The parking lot was nearly empty, just Pastor Hartley's black Cadillac and a few other vehicles she assumed belonged to evening Bible study attendees. The receptionist's desk sat vacant in the small lobby. A handwritten note directed visitors to ring the bell. Before Jessica could reach for it, Pastor Hartley appeared from a hallway, his smile warm and welcoming. He'd traded his Sunday suit for khaki slacks and a crisp white shirt. The sleeves rolled to his elbows in a way that made him seem more approachable, less formal. "Sister Jessica, right on time," he said, gesturing toward the hallway. "My office is just back here. We'll have complete privacy for our discussion." His office was larger than she'd expected, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined with theological texts and framed photographs of Pastor Hartley, with various dignitaries and celebrities who'd visited the church over the decades. A large mahogany desk dominated one side of the room, but he guided her instead to a seating area with 2 comfortable armchairs positioned near a window overlooking a small garden. "I find formal desks create barriers," he explained, settling into his chair. "When we counsel, we need to be equals before the Lord. Just 2 souls seeking guidance." For the first hour, their conversation felt genuine. Pastor Hartley asked probing questions about her childhood in rural Tennessee, her strained relationship with her father, her dreams of singing that had brought her to Atlanta. He shared stories from his own youth, his struggles with faith, his late wife who'd passed 5 years earlier. Jessica found herself relaxing, opening up in ways she hadn't with anyone since moving to the city. "You remind me of Sarah," he said softly, his eyes distant. My wife when she was young. That same fire, that determination to matter in this world. He stood and moved to a cabinet against the wall, retrieving 2 crystal glasses and an unmarked bottle filled with dark amber liquid. Sarah used to make this, he said, his voice thick with emotion. A family recipe passed down through generations of her people in Louisiana. Herbs, roots, honey from local hives. She called it her comfort tonic. Always said it helped troubled souls find their path. Jessica hesitated as he poured generous amounts into both glasses. She'd never been much of a drinker, and something about accepting alcohol from a pastor in his private office felt inappropriate. But his face held such genuine sadness, such warmth that refusing seemed cruel. To new beginnings, Pastor Hartley said, raising his glass. The liquid was sweet at first, with flavors Jessica couldn't quite identify. Beneath the honey she tasted something earthy, almost metallic, and herbs that made her tongue tingle. The pastor sipped from his own glass, though she noticed he barely wet his lips before setting it aside. "Tell me about your music," he said, leaning forward. "What do you sing? What speaks to your soul?" As Jessica began to answer, she felt warmth spreading through her chest and limbs, a pleasant lightness that made the room seem softer around the edges. The pastor's voice took on an almost melodic quality, his questions becoming more personal, more intimate. How long since she'd been in a relationship did she feel lonely here in Atlanta? What did she desire most in this world? The conversation blurred. Jessica remembered laughing at something he said, remembered him moving his chair closer, his hand on her knee feeling paternal at first, then less so. She remembered standing, the room tilting slightly, Pastor Hartley's arm around her waist, guiding her through a door she hadn't noticed before. "There's a rest area." His voice seemed to come from far away. "You need to lie down for a moment. Let Sarah's tonic work its blessing." The room beyond was dim, furnished simply with a daybed and soft lighting. Jessica's legs felt unsteady, her thoughts swimming through honey. She was aware of lying down, of Pastor Hartley's voice continuing its steady stream of words she couldn't quite grasp, of his hands that had seemed so paternal now touching her in ways that her clouded mind knew were wrong, but couldn't resist. The last clear thought Jessica had before everything dissolved into fragmented sensations was the realization that this wasn't counseling at all, and that she'd walked willingly into something far more dangerous than mere financial desperation. Jessica woke to fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the acrid smell of industrial cleaner. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't place where she was. The ceiling tiles were water-stained, the walls painted that institutional beige found in schools and government buildings. Her mouth tasted like copper and earth. Her head pounding with a hangover that felt different from any she'd experienced before. She was still in the room behind Pastor Hartley's office, lying on the daybed fully clothed, but with her shoes placed neatly on the floor beside her. Pale morning light filtered through a small window near the ceiling. According to her phone, it was 6:15 on Tuesday morning. She'd been unconscious for nearly 12 hours. Jessica sat up slowly, immediately regretting the movement as nausea rolled through her stomach. Her skin felt wrong, too tight and too cold despite the Atlanta summer heat already building outside. When she tried to stand, her legs trembled with weakness that seemed to emanate from deep within her bones. The main office was empty, silent in the early morning stillness. Pastor Hartley was nowhere to be seen, and the door to the parking lot stood unlocked. Jessica stumbled through it into the humid Georgia dawn, squinting against sunlight that felt unnaturally bright and harsh against her eyes. Her car sat alone in the parking lot. She had vague memories of the pastor's voice, his hands, the sensation of something vital being drawn out of her with each breath she took. But the details remained frustratingly hazy, like trying to remember a dream that dissolved upon waking. The drive back to her apartment took twice as long as usual. Jessica had to pull over 3 times, overcome by waves of dizziness and nausea. In the rearview mirror, her face looked pallid, almost gray, with dark circles under her eyes that made her appear years older than her 24 years. Inside her studio apartment, Jessica stripped off her clothes and stood under a scalding shower, trying to wash away the feeling of contamination that clung to her skin. That's when she noticed the discoloration, faint reddish marks spreading across her lower abdomen that looked almost like bruises but felt different under her fingers, tender and unnaturally warm. By noon, the marks had darkened to purple and spread. Jessica called in sick to both her jobs, her voice barely above a whisper. The weakness had intensified, leaving her unable to stand for more than a few minutes without her vision graying at the edges. She tried to eat crackers from her pantry, but couldn't keep anything down. What frightened her most was the smell. A sour, organic odor seemed to be emanating from her own body, growing stronger as the hours passed. She'd showered 3 times, but nothing helped. When she finally worked up the courage to examine herself more closely, Jessica saw that the discoloration had taken on a grayish tinge around the edges, the skin there feeling cool and slightly numb to the touch. Keisha called at 4 in the afternoon, her voice bright with concern. "Girl, you okay? They said you called in sick to both jobs. That's not like you." Jessica wanted to tell her everything, wanted to explain about Pastor Hartley and the drink and waking up 12 hours later. But shame kept the words locked in her throat. How could she admit she'd been so stupid, so trusting? What exactly would she even say happened? She couldn't remember clearly enough to make accusations, and who would believe her anyway? He was Pastor William Hartley, beloved leader of Eternal Grace for 40 years. "Just a stomach bug," Jessica lied, her voice weak. "I'll be fine in a day or 2. But she wouldn't be fine. As Tuesday evening descended into night, the pain began in earnest, a burning sensation that radiated from her core outward through her limbs. Jessica lay on her bathroom floor, too weak to make it back to bed, watching the discoloration spread up her torso like dark fingers reaching for her heart. By Wednesday morning, she knew she needed help. But when she tried to call 911, her hands shook so badly she couldn't hold the phone. The last clear thought Jessica had before losing consciousness was that Pastor Hartley had done this to her, and that somewhere in Atlanta, he was preparing to do it again to someone else. Keisha found Jessica on Wednesday afternoon, after she'd missed her shift at the diner for the 2nd day and wasn't answering calls or texts. Using the spare key Jessica had given her for emergencies, she let herself into the studio apartment and followed the smell to the bathroom, where her friend lay unconscious on the cold tile floor. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, their expressions shifting from routine concern to alarm when they assessed Jessica's condition. Her vital signs were weak and erratic. Her skin displayed extensive discoloration that one of them muttered didn't match any infection pattern he'd seen in 15 years on the job. They rushed her to Grady Memorial Hospital, Atlanta's primary trauma center, with lights and sirens clearing the afternoon traffic. Dr. Michael Chen had been an emergency physician at Grady for 7 years, treating everything from gunshot wounds to overdoses in one of the city's busiest ERs. But when he examined Jessica Morrison, he found himself reaching for his phone to call the infectious disease specialist, then the toxicology team, then finally his supervisor, because nothing about her presentation made medical sense. "Her tissue is necrotizing at a rate I've never witnessed," Dr. Chen explained to the assembled team 2 hours later. "It started in the pelvic region and is spreading systematically through the lower abdomen. But every culture comes back negative. No bacteria, no virus, no fungal infection. Her white blood cell count is through the roof. But we can't identify what her body is fighting." The toxicology screen revealed traces of compounds they couldn't fully identify, herbal alkaloids that didn't match any known drugs of abuse. When Jessica briefly regained consciousness that evening, delirious with fever, she kept repeating 3 words: "Pastor Hartley's drink." A nurse with 20 years of experience at Grady overheard those words and felt her stomach drop. She pulled Dr. Chen aside in the hallway, her voice low and urgent. "I need you to pull some files. Patient names: Destiny Williams, admitted April 2018. Shanice Robinson, June 2020. Angela Hayes, November 2022. I remember them because they all died here. Same symptoms, same unexplained tissue death. And I remember one other thing. They'd all mentioned being counseled by pastors or church elders before they got sick." Dr. Chen spent that night in the medical records department, pulling files that painted a horrifying picture. 3 young women, ages 21 to 26, all previously healthy, all dead within a week of admission from rapid systemic necrosis. The attending physicians had documented their confusion, their inability to find a causative agent, their frustration as they watched young lives slip away despite every intervention modern medicine could offer. By Thursday morning, Detective Lisa Armstrong of the Atlanta Police Department's Major Crimes Unit was standing in the ICU, staring through the glass at Jessica Morrison's unconscious form. At 42, Armstrong had investigated murders, rapes, and every variation of human cruelty Atlanta had to offer. But the medical records Dr. Chen had shared suggested something that fell outside normal criminal parameters. 4 women in 6 years, same symptoms, same outcome, Armstrong said, reviewing her notes, and your patient mentioned a pastor. Destiny Williams' intake notes mention pastoral counseling, Dr. Chen confirmed, pulling up the digital records on his tablet. Shanice Robinson's family told the social worker she'd been getting spiritual guidance for depression. Angela Hayes had church elder written in her emergency contact information. Armstrong had her team pull phone records, social media accounts, and credit card statements for all 4 women. The connections emerged slowly but undeniably. Destiny Williams had attended 3 services at Eternal Grace Pentecostal Church in the month before her death. Shanice Robinson had posted a photo on Instagram tagged at the same church. Angela Hayes' bank records showed a donation to Eternal Grace 2 weeks before her admission to Grady. And all 4 women had met privately with Pastor William Hartley for counseling sessions in the weeks before they fell ill. By Thursday evening, Armstrong sat in her car outside the Eternal Grace Pentecostal Church, watching the faithful arrive for evening services. Through her windshield, she could see Pastor Hartley greeting congregants at the door, his silver hair gleaming under the entrance lights, his smile warm and welcoming. He looked like everyone's idealized grandfather, a pillar of the community, a man who dedicated his life to spiritual service. He also looked like a serial killer who'd been hunting young women in plain sight for at least 6 years, using his position of trust and authority to select victims who were vulnerable, isolated, and unlikely to be believed if they tried to report what he'd done to them before the symptoms rendered them unable to speak at all. Detective Armstrong didn't have enough for a warrant. 4 women attending the same church wasn't evidence of a crime, even with the suspicious deaths. She needed something concrete, something that would convince a judge that Pastor William Hartley was more than just a spiritual counselor who'd had the misfortune of knowing women who'd died from mysterious illnesses. She started with background checks. Hartley had been born in rural Mississippi in 1951, ordained at a small Pentecostal seminary in Louisiana in 1974, and had served at various churches throughout the South before founding Eternal Grace in Atlanta in 1983. His wife Sarah had died in 2018 from what medical records listed as natural causes related to advanced age, though Armstrong noted she'd only been 64. Financial records showed Hartley lived modestly on his pastoral salary. No unusual bank transactions, no hidden accounts. His tax returns were clean going back decades. On paper, he was exactly what he appeared to be, a devoted minister who'd spent his life serving his community. But Armstrong had learned to trust her instincts over paperwork, and every instinct she had was screaming that Hartley was dangerous. On Friday morning, she received a call from Dr. Chen. Jessica Morrison is lucid. She's asking to speak with police. Armstrong arrived at Grady within 20 minutes. Jessica looked like she'd aged 20 years in 4 days. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, the tissue necrosis visible as dark patches spreading across her exposed arms. But her eyes were clear, focused with the determination of someone who knew time was running out. "He drugged me," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The drink he gave me, he called it his wife's family recipe, herbs and roots from Louisiana. He said it would help me find my path, but it was something else, something that made me weak, made everything blur." "Did he assault you?" Armstrong asked gently. "I think so. I can't remember clearly. but I know he did something to me while I was unconscious. When I woke up, I felt empty, like something had been taken from inside me. Jessica's hand moved to her abdomen, where the worst of the necrosis had begun. He's done this before, hasn't he? I'm not the first. Armstrong showed her photos of Destiny Williams, Shanice Robinson, and Angela Hayes. Jessica's face crumpled with recognition and grief. They look like me. Young, alone, desperate. That's who he chooses, isn't it? Girls who won't be missed right away, who won't be believed if they try to tell anyone. Help me stop him, Armstrong said. Tell me everything you remember about that office, that room, anything that might help us build a case. Jessica talked for 40 minutes, describing details that would prove crucial. The unmarked bottle with the dark liquid, the hidden door to the room behind his office, the way he'd barely drunk from his own glass, the crystal glasses themselves, which Jessica remembered had an unusual etched pattern on them. Most importantly, Jessica remembered seeing other photographs in his office beyond the famous visitors and dignitaries. Personal photos on a bookshelf behind his desk, including several of young women she didn't recognize, all roughly the same age, all smiling beside Pastor Hartley with what looked like genuine affection and trust. Armstrong left the hospital with enough to request a search warrant. By Friday afternoon, she was standing before a judge, presenting medical records, witness testimony, and the pattern of deaths that connected directly to Hartley's private counseling sessions. The judge, a woman who'd seen enough predators hide behind positions of respect, signed the warrant. The search team descended on the church offices Friday evening, just as the sun was setting over Atlanta. Pastor Hartley opened the door with his characteristic warm smile, which faltered only slightly when Armstrong showed him the warrant. "I don't understand," he said, his voice carrying that practiced tone of confused innocence. "What could you possibly be looking for?" "The room behind your office," Armstrong said, watching his face carefully. "The one with the day bed where you counsel young women privately." Something flickered in Hartley's eyes, gone so quickly Armstrong almost missed it. Fear, or perhaps calculation. "I have nothing to hide," he said, stepping aside. "Search whatever you need to search." What they found in the next 3 hours would reveal that Pastor William Hartley had been hiding quite a lot indeed. The evidence team found the unmarked bottle first, hidden in a locked cabinet in Hartley's private office. The dark amber liquid inside would later be analyzed by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's lab, revealing a complex mixture of herbal compounds, including monkshood, belladonna, and several alkaloids derived from plants native to Louisiana's bayou regions. Mixed with these were trace amounts of compounds the lab couldn't fully identify, substances that seemed designed to induce suggestibility, memory impairment, and a profound physiological response that medical examiners would spend months trying to understand. In the room behind the office, forensic technicians found biological evidence from multiple individuals on the daybed, despite obvious attempts at cleaning. DNA samples would eventually match not just Jessica Morrison, but Angela Hayes and Shanice Robinson as well. Destiny Williams's DNA was found on a blanket stored in a closet that Hartley apparently couldn't bring himself to dispose of. But the most damning evidence came from Hartley's personal files, meticulously kept in a locked drawer of his desk. Counseling notes on 17 young women spanning 12 years, each entry documenting their vulnerabilities with clinical precision. Financial struggles, family estrangement, addiction recovery, recent breakups. Hartley had been cataloging prey, identifying which women in his congregation were isolated enough to be targeted, desperate enough to accept private counseling, and unlikely enough to be immediately believed if they reported what happened. Photographs tucked into these files showed women at various stages of what appeared to be the same progression Jessica was experiencing. Some looked merely tired and pale. Others displayed visible signs of the tissue necrosis, photographed with detached documentary precision. 7 of the women in these photographs were later identified as having died in hospitals throughout Georgia and neighboring states over the past decade, all from unexplained systemic organ failure that doctors had attributed to unknown infections or environmental toxins. Detective Armstrong found Pastor Hartley in his office, sitting calmly at his desk as the search team worked around him. His composure had returned. His face settled into an expression of serene acceptance. "You're going to try to make this about evil," he said quietly. "About a monster who preyed on innocent girls, but you don't understand what you've found." "Then explain it to me," Armstrong said, turning on her body camera to record his statement. Sarah's grandmother was a traiteur, a healer from the Bayou parishes. She understood things your modern medicine doesn't acknowledge. The way life force can be transferred, redirected, used to sustain one life by drawing from another. Sarah taught me before she passed, made me promise to continue the practice. His voice held no remorse, only a disturbing certainty. Those girls were lost already, adrift and purposeless. I gave their lives meaning by allowing their energy to sustain my ministry, my ability to guide others toward salvation. Armstrong felt sick listening to him rationalize 17 victims as spiritual practice. You murdered them, you drugged them, assaulted them, and infected them with something that destroyed their bodies from the inside out. I extended my years of service, Hartley corrected. The Lord needs his shepherds to remain strong, vital, capable of leading his flock. What I took from them allowed me to continue his work. The arrest was quiet, almost anticlimactic. Hartley didn't resist as Armstrong read him his rights, didn't protest as officers led him from the church he'd built. Congregants arriving for Friday evening services watched in confusion and growing horror as their spiritual leader was placed in the back of a police cruiser, his silver hair gleaming under the flashing lights. Jessica Morrison died on Saturday morning at 6:23 a.m. Her body finally succumbing to the systematic destruction Hartley's concoction had initiated. Dr. Chen held her hand in the final moments, promising her that her testimony would help ensure Hartley never hurt anyone else. Keisha arrived just minutes too late, collapsing in the hallway outside the ICU, her grief echoing through the sterile corridors. The trial would take 18 months to reach court. Hartley's defense attorneys argued insufficient evidence, claimed the herbal mixture was harmless traditional medicine, suggested the women had died from unrelated causes. But the forensic evidence, the DNA, the photographs, and the testimony of 2 other women who'd survived early-stage exposure after single encounters with Hartley, proved overwhelming. In December 2025, William Hartley was convicted of 4 counts of felony murder, 7 counts of voluntary manslaughter, and multiple counts of sexual assault and drug-facilitated assault. At 74, he was sentenced to life without possibility of parole in a Georgia state prison, where he would die 3 years later from complications of pneumonia. Eternal Grace Pentecostal Church closed its doors permanently in early 2025. The building stood empty for 2 years before being purchased by a community organization and converted into a women's shelter, a small redemption for the horror that had unfolded within its walls. Detective Armstrong kept Jessica Morrison's photo on her desk, a reminder that predators often hide behind the very institutions meant to protect the vulnerable, and that trust given too freely can become a weapon in practiced hands.